coaching the long jump, an overview. And that's what this evening will really be about, is an overview of the event. There's so much to the event that we feel we need to kind of break it into sections. So tonight is really just to kind of set the scene almost, and consider some of the things that we think about as coaches when coaching the event. But of course, it's not just coaching the event, you're coaching the athlete and you're coaching the individual. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this evening. In the way of introductions, I've done a number of these now for a few months, and I've not really kind of formally introduced myself, I suppose. So my name is Darren Ritchie. I'm the new event group lead for jumps and combined events for England Athletics, and started that at the turn of the year. And it's been an interesting 3 or 4 months, not what I expected it to be, given with the lockdown we've had with COVID-19. But a little bit of background to me. I was a long jumper myself, and proud to be still the Scottish record holder. But I'm hoping that some young bucks coming through will be able to take that. But regardless, I'll be the first Scotsman to jump over 8 metres, and that will stay. British champion, I've won 3 British titles over my career. And then when I finished, retired, I kind of really got into coaching pretty quickly, and went through the coach education format as it was then, and got my level 4 in long jump there. But in addition to coaching athletics, my passion is strength and conditioning. And so I went through and got my accredited UKSCA status as a strength and conditioning coach as well. And that kind of influences quite a lot of my philosophy and my approach around how we coach jumps. But after beyond that, I really wanted to know a little bit more around coaching, and so I went to University of Stirling and done my master's in performance coaching. And for me, that really opened my eyes up to what coaching was and all the kind of intricacies around it. Coaching experience-wise, I've coached athletes to world youth level, European under-23, and Commonwealth Games. And in terms of team coach over the years, over the last 10, 12 years, 14 years that I've been, since I've retired, I've been involved with primarily Team Scotland at Commonwealth youth level and Commonwealth Games, but also Team GB at European Juniors, World Juniors, and European under-23. So so that's a little bit about me. But what I'm really kind of pleased about and impressed about is then we've got Frank Atto online this evening with us as well. And Frank, like me, is a former 3 years champion. Again, he's qualified level 3 within performance coach jumps, but that really doesn't really kind of sum up Frank really. For me, it's about his coaching experience. It's nearly 40 years. I was tying up the sums earlier, Frank. It's nearly 40 years of coaching, and to be honest, there's very few coaches in the UK and to be honest in the world who have coached to Frank's kind of heights, but also the depth, the number of athletes he's worked with. Tracer Smith, Asha Hansen, these are household names. He's coached Amelia Adama. So there's 2 girls there who's jumped over 15 under Frank's guard, and also guided Greg Rutherford and Chris Tomlinson along their career as well. And we all know what the story is there. But so it's great that we've got Frank on this evening as well to bring his knowledge and expertise to the presentation. We have some comments from people to say that they can't see us or hear us. The best platform, if you're using Edge, it's best to look at Chrome or Safari. Try resetting, coming out, and then coming back in again. That would be my recommendation there. In terms of Q&As, there will be a Q&A moment section at the end of this presentation. So, but feel free to pose your questions in the box in the bottom right-hand corner, and we will get going. We've got a little bit of people coming back saying nothing doing, but we'll crack on, assuming that people can hear us, Frank. In terms of introductions, would you like to add anything to that, Frank?
No, that's it really. I think most people do know me. as she said, I've been in the sport for a number of years. Frustrated athlete, coaching myself for many years before getting my international, and then lots of injuries. So I actually stopped my athletics career a lot earlier than most, and I thought I'd give my time to coaching, and here I am, 40 years on. Having said coaching, I also worked for BT for 38 years, BT International, traveling around the world and resolving issues. So yeah, I'm a person that likes to solve problems.
Cool. And that's what coaching's about, huh?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, listen, we'll kick off. For me, in terms of starting this evening, is kind of having a bit of an idea around a bit of history around the long jump, and we have two people here who have held the records. Galina, who's held the record since 1988 with 7:52, and Mike Powell with 8:95. And for me, it's just kicking off this evening with just a little bit of just looking back to Mike Powell's jump in Tokyo in '91. This would have been better with sound, but yeah. The furthest jump in history, and I think it's such a good jump. I would like to see that again, even though I've seen it loads of times. If we can play that again. There we go. In a competition years ago in Bad Langensalza, it's a long jump meet in Germany. I met Mike Powell, and it was great and a privilege to hear him tell about that story firsthand from, when Carl Lewis was jumped 891, and then Mike Powell kind of describes going over to his coach and to the audience. That's not going to win it. He knew he was going to win that competition and break the world record that day. And even just kind of thinking back on that story, the goosebumps in the back of my head, the hairs in the back of my head were standing up, and awesome achievement. And we have some athletes coming back, getting close to that, the Cuban Echeverria and such, but not quite there yet. So just in a way as an introduction, there's a long jump there. Some stuff I want to cover beforehand before we get into the kind of technical elements of the long jump. There are kind of other things that we need to consider as coaches. It is about developing the athlete, and I mentioned this earlier, is that we're not just coaching long jumpers and coaching athletes, we're coaching individuals, and these are the kind of four pillars, the four factors that we need to consider developing within our program as coaches and developing the athlete. And at the top, we've got the tactical. Those are the arena and the competition skills that athletes hone over their lifetime of competing, is learning how to compete in that arena within that. The technical stuff, those are the actions and the postures of the event, and we'll go into that a little bit tonight, but through the series of that. And then the key thing for me is the stuff that underpins that is the physical, the movement efficiency and the consistency and the metabolic fitness. So we're talking about the movement efficiency of those underpinning foundation movements that underpin those technical actions. And we're talking about squat, lunge, push, pull, brace, hinge, land, rotate. All of these foundation movements underpin those technical actions. Whether you take off, accelerate, land, all of that stuff is underpinned by these foundation movements. And we're looking at efficiency, consistency, be able to do that repeatedly, and resilient under fatigue and under pressure, to be able to execute technically under pressure. But the last one really is they're all equally as important as each other. But I think that the mental behavioral one is really key, and it really relates down to when you're coaching the individual on that. And in terms of coaching the behavioral elements or developing those behavioral elements in the athlete, we're talking about athletes having attitude, positive attitude, having that commitment and discipline, and that makes a permanent contribution to the lives and the lives of others. But looking at that dedication, the perseverance, respect, humility, you could be the best athlete technically and physically, be gifted, but if you don't have these behavioural elements, and we're not considering these behavioural elements like perseverance, respect, humility, where we're developing that individual where they interact positively with others, we're really doing our athletes potentially a disservice. And I've got a quote here that if they can't handle their lives outside the sport, they're not going to be able to handle themselves, their lives in the sport. And it's very much about, training doesn't stop, or you don't stop being an athlete when you leave training. It's a 24-hour, 7 days a week occupation, I suppose. So I've got this kind of question here just to leave you guys just thinking a little bit around where are your reps and sets for developing these behavioural elements within your coaching practice. So something to think about, and it's such an important subject that we'll probably do another webinar just specifically on that behavioural element before. And I know Scott Simpson's talked about that previously in his pole vault webinar. So underpinning the technical model, there are some things and some non-negotiables, and these are the biomechanical principles. And for us, this is really there have been different phrases around what you would describe these biomechanical principles and what are they. But it's really the mechanics of motion and the body in motion, and the body is exposed to and expressing internal and external forces. So it's basically the science behind that. And the technical model of any event is based and underpinned by the principles of these biomechanics. And we talk about kinesiology and the science of movement. So that there are things that we need to consider, and we'll look at some of them this evening. But it's the style that the athlete adopts is determined by their physical characteristics. So we may have a technical model or things that we there are lots of different techniques out there, and we probably describe them as more as styles, and that is unique to that individual. Everyone will have, and we've got a couple of videos this evening, and they are completely different individuals, and they've got different styles in which they jump, that they all jump for. I've got a quote here by Kelvin Giles, who's a mentor of mine around the physical preparation and athletic development world. Athletes must have the physical competence to do the technical stuff and the technical qualities to do the tactical stuff in that order. Physical competence, what I mean by that is the presence of movement efficiency in these foundation movements that we talked about. These are squat, lunge, push, pull, brace, hinge, land, rotate. So it doesn't matter what we do within our jumping from a technical point of view. If we don't have physical competence in each of these areas, that's going to have a negative effect on the technical element, and it could actually take some performance away from the distance and from the athlete. So these are really important on that. So the next slide for me is, again, it's relating to that physical element. Before we really we're looking at the overview of the technique, are these biomotor abilities. And these have been described as components of fitness and other education. So these biomotor abilities are the components of fitness that we need to develop and train in our athletes. And all of these are critical for long jump, and really critical for any event. But in relation to long jump, and just kind of have an example in each, from a speed point of view, we'll talk shortly that the speed and the horizontal velocity or the resultant velocity at takeoff is a critical component for distance jumped. So if you don't have that speed element down the runway, and we're not developing the athlete's speed, then that's going to limit their ability to jump far. And that's something that having come in post, that I've started to look at some of the horizontal velocities of athletes in England and in the UK, and looking at where they're at. And if you want to be jumping over 8 meters, there's a speed and a velocity that you really need to be hitting down the runway. And if you're not hitting that, then doesn't matter how good your technique is, you're not going to hit that distance. Equally strength, and there are lots of different types of strength. Within this diagram, we talk about maximal strength, elastic strength, and that reactive strength, and strength endurance there. And we probably won't get into it this evening, but certainly when we get into looking at acceleration, we're looking at developing that stiffness and reactive strength and upright running. And we're looking at, when we look at takeoff, we need that eccentric strength to load up the extensors on flexion at takeoff, and then looking at the concentric strength beyond that. So that stuff we'll look at there. Flexibility is really key. You know, if we have tight hip flexors, hip extensors, that's going to limit our stride length, which could have an effect on the velocity that we run down the runway. It could have an impact on the height of center of mass at takeoff. And we've all seen these images with athletes nice and tall through the air and getting into that excellent leg shoot. But if we've got really tight hamstrings, tight hip flexors, that's really going to limit the individual's ability to get into those positions that we need to see. Endurance is one of the key biomotor abilities, and I've put down developing capacity here, because I'm not talking about for endurance for long jump. You know, most athletes will run down the runway. The elite athletes in the male, you'll be looking at 40, 45 meters, and for women, you're talking 35, 40 meters on some of the ones who've got longer strides, number of strides. But it's about the repeatability, developing the capacity to repeat that performance at the highest level, so they're hitting it every time. So we know in a competition that you'll have 3 or 4 run-throughs on the runway. Ideally, you know, sometimes we just get limited to 2, but you're maybe talking 3 or 4 run-throughs in practice, and then you've got your first 3 attempts, and then the next 3. You need to have the capacity to develop to run down that runway at optimum velocity for an effective takeoff. So we need to develop that capacity. So I've kind of thrown that in there, and of course, balance and coordination. All of this is you'll see the best athletes in the world with perfect balance, and the coordination is like it's just so fluid, and we talk about this kind of neuromuscular coordination, which we need for sprinting fast, because sprinting is a skill, to be able to coordinate the penultimate and the takeoff, and coordinate the arms and the limbs to control that rotation after takeoff, and then coordinate that leg shoot. All of that is really, really important. So where we're kind of going in, we'll be going into the technical bit shortly. It's really important that the technical model is underpinned by all of this stuff. So on the back of tonight, we'd be reflecting on, where do these components sit in my program? Do they sit in my program? Where do they sit? How often do they sit? And how am I monitoring all of this? So how are you monitoring your speed, the strength, your flexibility, that capacity? How are you monitoring that work capacity that athletes got? And of course, your balance and coordination. Okay, Frank, any questions on that? Anything you want to add to that?
That's fine. That's fine.
Cool. Thanks, boss. Okay, so the aim of long jump is a quote from Phil Graham-Smith, and it's really straightforward. The aim of long jump is to attain maximum horizontal distance from the front of the board. That's it. So Phil Graham-Smith was one of the leading biomechanists in the UK, worked with many of the jumpers, worked with Frank and his athletes previously, and led a lot of the research in taking off, the kinesiology of the takeoff and stuff. And we'll look into some of that at the takeoff webinar in the next next couple of sessions. But the long jump is really easy to do, but I would say it's the most difficult event to get right. Would that be a fair statement, Frank?
Yeah, all the events are difficult when you really get into it.
Yeah, but I think, you know, you can run and jump, that's straightforward. But I think to get that right, to get the timing and everything, I think it's one of the difficult events. So. Okay, cool. So now we know what long jump, the aim of long jumping is. James Hay, biomechanist, and he created this deterministic model for long jump. You know, my background is I'm a kind of trained electronic design engineer, and so I like formulas. I like this structure. It's kind of how I was educated when I left school. So I like this clean kind of science approach of this. So this deterministic model, everything feeds and impacts into, and ultimately the jump distance at the top. So if you look at the takeoff distance, if I go back a slide, the takeoff distance is L1. So basically the center of mass, where we see that dotted line and that dot, that is that takeoff distance from toe off. So that's what we talk about. As soon as we get toe off to that center of mass, that is L1. That's the takeoff distance. The flight distance is, I'm going to jump back in between the slides. The flight distance is L2, is the point from the center of mass at toe off all the way through to the center of mass once the heels break the sand. So that's the flight distance. That's L2. And then L3 is the landing distance. Again, center of mass to break in the sand. Now, with each of these, there are some further things that influence and impact on that. Now, accuracy at takeoff will have an impact. So how far an athlete is away from the plasticine. And the body position, which we've seen, is that toe off to there. So that's what we're talking about in the body position. The flight distance, and a lot of the research, and we'll spend some time on this tonight, is the components that impact on the flight distance. So that is the height of the center of mass at takeoff. So going back to this slide, so the height here of that center of mass at takeoff is one of the critical factors. So an athlete who's 6 foot versus an athlete at 5 foot will have different heights of center of mass, and that will ultimately affect the flight distance in the long jump. We've got velocity, and I've got VR, which is resultant velocity. And the resultant velocity is a component of the horizontal velocity and the vertical velocity. And we'll look at that shortly as well. So the resultant velocity will have an impact on the flight distance, and then the angle of takeoff. So you could have a really great high angle, like say 45 degrees, but that's probably more akin to something you would want to see as you're going more up the way. And of course, it would be higher for high jump, but a long jump, if you're down at 10 to 12 degrees, it's too flat. So there is an optimum or a range of angle of takeoff we want to look at. And then landing distance of body position, similar to the body position at takeoff, it's that point, that distance from the heels to the center of mass. And again, actions on landing. And we'll look at one example of this, is that actions on landing will determine the distance. So ideally, we want the athlete passing through and beyond the heels as they break the sand coming into the long jump. What we don't want to see is breaking the sand and then the body following and falling and breaking the sand closer to the takeoff board, because that's just going to take distance away from that. And some of the information, some of the data that we'll look at from previous championships will measure that. And all of these ultimately have an impact on that final distance in athlete jumps. Okay. There's quite a lot of information that I've taken on, I've thrown in on there. So what I want to do is just look at the takeoff distance, and we've got two different examples of Echeverria and the Greek Tegulo. We're looking at different ways of taking off, and I'll see if I can fire up Echeverria first. Okay. Many of you will be familiar with this jump. This was in Stockholm a couple of years ago, 2018, where he jumped 883, I think it was. But Echeverria has is very upright, not a lot of extension on the takeoff, but he's very much straight up. But his height is significantly taller than the Greek athlete. and he, well, jumped out the pit. I think that was a 1 meter board coming off, so let's just watch that once more. So again, we're looking at where is the center of mass in relation to the board at toe off. And hopefully, in contrast, this one will, this is Tentouglu, the Greek athlete. This was at the European Indoor Championships in Glasgow. And I'll throw this a few times for us to see. But coming in, slightly different approach to Echeverria, but look at the extension of the board there as he's taken off. And he's really pushing his hips and his center of mass across the board much more, where Echeverria was going very much focusing on a larger vertical component. But there are two different athletes. There are two, you know, size-wise are different animals. And so they've got different strategies and different approaches to jump far. So that's something for the takeoff. Any comments on that, Frank?
No, it's fine. Two different techniques.
Yeah.
The takeoff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we talk about flight distance, and flight distance is essentially this parabolic curve. And this is an illustration. It's been, you know, it's been widely used out there, and they talk about these parabolic trajectories of the center of mass. And you're looking at Sotomayor, and we talk about the high jump having a higher angle, but the objectives are different. They need to jump as high as possible, whereas the long jump, you need to jump as long as possible. And here we've got an illustration, the difference between Powell's jump when he jumped 895 and Carl Lewis with his 891. And really the difference is Mike's takeoff angle was slightly higher. The thing with flight distance and the thing with takeoff, and we had Harry Murray on the webinar a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about this, is that within the long jump, as soon as you take off, two things happen. The body starts to rotate, and the body starts to, and the velocity of the individual starts to slow down. So those are the two things. That's physics. You know, we can't change that. We can't change that predetermined parabolic curve, but we can't extend it, but we can do a lot to shorten that curve by, you know, being unable to handle those unwanted rotations and really cutting that curve short early. And we'll look at that. Hopefully we'll have some examples of that tonight. But certainly when we get into flight and landing series, we'll look at that much closely. So the flight distance is ultimately determined by the height of the center of mass at takeoff, which we talked about, the velocity at takeoff, and here illustrated by this red arrow is the resultant velocity that we talked about. So you've got the horizontal component and then the vertical component, and then the angle of takeoff, of course. And then looking at landing distance. So landing distance is the center of mass to the breaking of the sand. We can see underneath that diagram, we've got an individual where we can see it looks as if that boy is going to be breaking that sand pit earlier than where his hips are. And I've got an image of Vespanovich there because I think she's one of the world's best athletes for leg shooting, but also has a potential issue, and she's been caught out a number of times with her hair catching the sand back. She's jumped phenomenal distances and got herself in brilliant positions in the landing. But her approach and her strategy to deal with that, she does scoop herself into the pit. She's been caught out with our bib on the back of the vest has been the back mark rather than breaking the sand. And I've got an image from the indoors World Indoors in Birmingham here, where she actually loses quite a bit of distance on this. So we'll bring her in. We'll throw this a few times. But we see here how far our feet are in front of the center of mass. And then we can actually see how our head, our back and our head is actually the back mark. And of course, we talk about takeoff distance, and there is what, 12.8. So I'll play that once more, and then we'll see if I can maybe pause it as well. Okay, so we see here that she has broken the sand, and look where our center of mass is. I mean, our feet are hitting 7 meters, but our center of mass is still probably sitting over 620, 625. And then when we see her scooping into that area, look at that head. You know. So we saw her break the sandpit around that 7 meter mark, and then we've seen the whole body scooping in, and now she's got her hair tied up to try and tidy that back mark up, but it still caused an issue. So you could potentially be losing 15, 20 centimeters there, potentially.
So looking at that, Darren, that's quite easy to fix. What she should have done is lifted her feet up slightly when she broke the sandpit. But nevertheless, that's for a coach and there to sort out. But that's easily fixable.
Sure. And then if we just look at the takeoff here, so we're talking 12.8 centimeters. So if you're looking at 12 point, and if we finish the video, 674. So she finished with 674 in that distance. She's losing 12 centimeters at takeoff. So that takes her up to 685, 686. And if we were saying that on landing, she's potentially losing 15 to 20 centimeters there as well. That's a 7 meter jump given a 670 mark. So yeah, so there's big money, big centimeters to be gained by tidying up these areas. Okay, how are we doing for time? We started a wee bit late, so we're getting there. So as an overview, so again, I'm not going to go through every detail here. We will be spending more time in detail on each of the phases of a long jump in the following webinar series. But essentially, there are 4 phases. There's the approach, the takeoff, the flight, and the landing. And the approach phase, you've got the acceleration phase. It's more controlled, it's rhythmical. The acceleration, you still need to accelerate hard, but it still needs to be under control. So you've got that horizontal displacement to overcome inertia and get the body moving. And then once we're upright, we're looking at more vertical displacement, vertical pushing into the ground and maintaining that velocity coming in. Part of that, the penultimate, ideally those last 2 strides, penultimate strides coming in, we want to maintain, at worst, maintain horizontal velocity. Ideally, if we can accelerate into the board and off those strides, perfect. But within there are different strategies and preparing the individual, and the penultimate stride will be used to look at lowering the center of mass in preparation for takeoff. So there's a couple of things that happen. That the running action changes from cyclical to acyclical, and then we'll have this lowering of center of mass. And what that does is we'll look at that hip displacement vertically as the athlete takes off. That's ideally what we want to do. And we'll look at some of the numbers of different athletes and how they deal with it. Takeoff, you want to obtain that vertical velocity or lift. And we talked about there is a compression, there is that flexion around ankle, knee, and hip. Ideally around the ankle and the knee. And we talk about some of the maximum knee flexions or minimum knee flexions at takeoff. But there are huge forces going through there, and that's where the strength component really comes in, what we talked about earlier. You're, depending on the individual, but you could be looking at anything between 8 to 9 times body weight, Frank, at takeoff, forces going through. Yeah. So you need a huge strength component to be able to deal with that, and it's eccentric and concentric within there. And then the flight and the landing piece, there are different techniques that we use in the sail, hang, hitch kick, and I throw in a hitch hang, which is something I done was a combination of that. And all of that is about preparing the athlete for landing, controlling any unwanted rotation, and that typically is forward rotation from the takeoff. But ideally, it's preparing the athlete for the optimal position for landing. So as an overview of that. Again, you guys will be able to have a copy of this presentation. It will be available on Athletics Hub next week, and you'll be able to read the other detail within that. But in the next series of webinars, we'll be going into that a lot more detail. But for me, that's just a kind of high-level overview on where we are. So technical considerations, certainly when we're developing the technique and the athlete. As we talked about, there are 4 phases, but all four phases form part of one continuous movement. There's no point working on everything in isolation, where essentially the event is bringing everything together. We can practice them in isolation, but it's important that we bring them all together at some point. The kind of final consideration, just for note here, is often the cause of the problem lies in the preceding phases. And so perhaps looking at Spanovic's landing there, what's caused that scooping in may be caused by the backward rotation. So the backward rotation, so we talk about all things determined is determined by what precedes them. And this is the kind of the principle of causation, the cause and effect. So often what's happened in the landing, if you just focus on the landing, that's certainly something you need to consider as a coach. But you also need to look at what happened before, which may have caused that. So any over-rotating on landing, for example, may be caused by the takeoff positions and postures. And those takeoff postures and positions may actually be determined by what happened in the penultimate phase in the approach. And the penultimate may ultimately be affected by the running, which may be affected by ineffective acceleration, execution, or position. So I suppose from this point of view is don't just focus on what you see and try and fix that problem. Think about what happens sequentially prior to that, and that may resolve the issue. So going back to Spanovic, it may be that our trunk angle was just too far back at takeoff, which caused that backward rotation, for example. I'm not saying that's what she needs to do or should do, but something for her to consider. So some considerations on that. So for me, it's really spending the last kind of 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes, looking at going back to this deterministic model that we were introduced to earlier. And here is an example, an elite athlete, and some of the results that we got from the championships. The name doesn't matter. But for me here, we've got their effective distance was 8:57. And what made up that distance? So L1, that takeoff distance from toe off to center of mass was 0.39 meters. The flight distance was 7 meters 80. And then the landing distance was 0.38. So center of mass in there. What we have under here, though, is the accuracy at takeoff. So they lost 1 centimeter at takeoff. So pretty much, listen, that's as good as you're going to get without fouling the board, to be honest. But actions on landing, there was some distance lost. So from the center of mass, so the landing distance was 0.38, but that was the effective landing distance, but it could have been 0.5 had they not lost that sand break in there. So if you were to add in the 12 and the 13 centimeters, that could have been an 870 jump. And to be honest, that's huge. We're not, many medals are won and lost by a centimeter. So certainly things for things to think about. But the biggest component was the flight distance, 91%, and on average, 90% of the jump is made up from the flight distance. And if we look at center of mass at takeoff for this individual was 1.22 meters in the air. At toe off, that's where the hip was at toe off. The resultant velocity, so we've got three values here. The resultant velocity was 10.09 meters per second, which is really fast. The horizontal velocity was 10.59, so that's that direction, and the vertical was 3.13, so the resultant was 10.09. Those are the times that you're going to have to hit if you want to be jumping these distances. It's non-negotiable. So if you want to jump over 8 meters, you're talking minimum 10.2 meters per second. There are athletes who are maybe strength dominant athletes who could probably jump 8 with running less than speed than that, but we're not going further than 10 and bits, and then the angle of takeoff there. So if we look at women, again, a world-class distance 7:03, takeoff distance was 0.31. Flight distance 620, and again, we're still high, 88%, we're still up there. Landing distance, 0.52, huge amount of landing distance and nothing lost. So really maximize that. So that athlete has got a fantastic leg shoot and carrying that through, and we've lost a bit of accuracy on the takeoff. So we're throwing away 5 centimeters. But again, jumping 7:03, there's maybe only 1 or 2 instances at Major Championships where you're not going to medal with that distance. And again, some values here, center of mass at toe off, 115. Resultant velocity, slightly less, less than the men. But 9.53, we're still talking 9.53 meters per second running down the runway in vertical. So big, so we've got a higher angle of takeoff, and as a result, we've got a higher vertical velocity under that. But the resultant, we've lost some velocity here a little bit as well. But what am I going to question? It's over 7 meters for a female. Fantastic. But what we can see here, though, is flight distance has a huge influence on ultimate distance, and it's kind of 88, 90%, 91%. So we need to invest a lot of time influencing that flight distance. So how can we impact on height of takeoff, looking at the horizontal or the velocity, and looking at takeoff angles. So the last 3 slides I have really is looking at some of the critical factors that really relate back to that flight distance. And here we've got a slide which looks at 2 areas: the ground contact characteristics of the athlete, and then the preparation for takeoff, that penultimate stride element. So the ground contact time at takeoff. So we're spending really just over 1/10 of a second on the ground. For sprinting maximum velocity, you're talking 0.08, 0.09 seconds. So we're really spending very little time. The quicker you come down the runway, the less time you spend on the ground. The less time you spend on the ground, you need to have those physical qualities, those strength qualities, to be able to generate that vertical force over that shorter period of time. That's where you need to develop that reactive strength within that. But it's all about timing. The angle of takeoff here, so this is a female athlete, circa 7 meters. Angle of takeoff, 27. The angular velocity of the leg, and this is something that was measured in previous championships, but not so recently, is looking at the speed of the takeoff leg, and it's a negative value, minus 5.3. It's negative because the direction of the takeoff is going up the runway. So you're looking at the takeoff leg pulling back. So as you present the takeoff leg for takeoff, you're not just leaving it there. You're not just leaving it, sticking it out, and then traveling into the board. You need to present it and then start pulling it back. So as you pull that back and pull that takeoff leg down underneath the center of mass, there's a velocity attributed to that. The quicker the velocity you go back, the more speed you carry through. So that's what that value is. Maximum knee flexion at takeoff, and again we'll look at that. We want to be operating around that 145 degrees, and again there will be a bandwidth that athletes operate in based on their physical characteristics, their height, and their qualities that they bring. Again, we talked about horizontal, vertical, and resultant velocity. What we've got here is two values presented, one at touchdown. So as soon as that foot touches down, and then at takeoff. So we see the 2 different components there. The vertical velocity at touchdown is negative 0.31. So what we mean by that is that as at touchdown, the direction of the body is actually going down the way. So at touchdown at takeoff, we want to generate vertical lift. But first of all, we need to overcome that negative velocity. And that's where the strategies and the penultimate stride and stuff will come in. Because ultimately you want to generate vertical velocity. So in this individual, they're generating 3.79 meters per second vertical, but the resultant is 3.8. So if we had that vertical velocity at touchdown as 0, the resultant velocity at takeoff there would be 3.79, which would then have a more positive impact on the resultant velocity. So it's really important that we think about the hip position and what's actually happening coming in at takeoff, and we need to consider that. But those last 2 or 3 strides have a direct impact on that, and that's why we monitor that. Those distances. So in this individual, the third last stride is 225, 223, and actually 219. So stride length-wise, they're actually getting tighter and tighter, which then has a positive impact in the hip position in relation to the ground. So the hip position is coming up. So what might have happened here is this maximum knee flexion is caused that negative velocity. But we need that to load up the leg to take off. So hopefully that makes sense. Conscious of time. We've got a question there relating to that as well. So again, what I'll do is I'll flag these up. They'll be recorded. You'll have that. I'll send you a copy of the presentation as well, so you guys will have this anyways. But if you look at like Dwight Phillips, for example, 854, the velocities that he's coming in at, 11 meters per second, 11.12, 10.78. I mean, this guy can run 640 for 60 meters. I mean, he's lightning quick. 11 meters per second. You know, if you want to be jumping the 870s, you need to be hitting that distance, those times. But if you look at the stride length, the third and the second, so his penultimate, the second last, is 2.62. So he has a really big stride length in that penultimate. And then his last leg at takeoff is 2 meters. So the height of his hips are going up the way at takeoff. But he generates, I mean, we'll get some video footage of him for the next one. The amount of forward rotation that's generated as a result of that is huge. And that has a negative impact. I mean, you know, he's fighting, hustling in the air the whole time, trying to counter that forward rotation. And as a result, he always has a poor landing. And I say poor in the context of other, you know, greater landing. But his landing is compromised. But again, who am I to say he's jumping 850? So yeah. Again, we've got takeoff angles. So if we look at takeoff angles here, Dwight Phillips, 20 degrees. Godfrey Mokoena, a completely different athlete, completely different individual. He's probably another 8, 9, 10 centimeters taller than Dwight, but doesn't have the speed that he comes in. But the height at takeoff and the angle of takeoff sets him on a different parabolic curve, but still essentially jumps almost as far at 847. Again, we were just touching on this data, guys. We'll go into this a little bit more in future sessions. But again, Brittany Reese, 9.77, 9.89. You know, horizontal velocity is huge within that. Tatiana Lebedeva, again in that penultimate, 9.53 meters per second. So if you want to be jumping around that 7 meter mark, you need to be running that. Now, these times in 100 will probably equate to what, 11.2, 11.3, Frank?
Yeah, she was great.
So, like, if you want to be jumping 7 meters, you need to be, you know, well, you know, in the UK, if you're a female running 11.2, 11.3, you're a sprinter, is essentially what it would be. But these are the speeds you need to be doing if you want to be jumping these distances out there. And again, the takeoff angles here for Brittany Reese, Lebedeva, and that, the range, there's a big range. You know, we've got Maggie there at 17.5 degrees, right up to 24. So again, these are all being dictated by the individual, their physical characteristics, their qualities, and that kind of stuff as well. So I've rambled quite a lot for the last 45 minutes. So, questions from everyone, anyone? Thanks for listening.
I think there's one question out there, Darren.
One question. Any comments on that, Frank, from your perspective, before we crack into questions on any of that data?
No, what I did notice, I think we takeoff angle between that person who was a female and the male person were slightly different. So you were looking at 20 degrees for the male, takeoff. And it could range anything from 19 degrees to 26. So I normally work around about 21 degrees. That's what we should really be looking at. But, you know, we have different athletes, different body types, and different speeds on the runway. So just to be mindful that you don't go out there just, you know, teaching someone to take off at 24 degrees.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, we've got some questions coming in. Right, let's have a look at this one. What strategy could you introduce the concept of center of mass lowering slightly on the penultimate step to young athletes without them overthinking and losing speed in the last strides? Frank, I'm going to pass that over to you first, mate.
Yeah, it's simple enough. And what I try to do with my athletes is work on simplicity. The simpler the solution is, the better it is for the athlete. So someone like Chris Tomlinson, when he came to me, he used to just drop his center of gravity or center of mass. He used to just drop it. So the way to overcome that, the way we overcame it, was basically, I asked a simple question. I asked him to just stand tall and chase the board 5 strides out. It was so simple. Just chase the board. Yeah. So you don't slow down. You are now chasing a board that's in front of you, and that would help to overcome it. Yes, there are various techniques you can use, but for me, that, you know, for a younger athlete, it is really simple. Chase that board. Yeah, 5 stride out, chase it.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. We were talking about young athletes. We probably need a little bit more information around how young we're talking about, Rob. The key thing for me is that, and it lies within your question, without losing speed in the last strides. And I think for me, this is the penultimate would be something I'd be looking at for with an athlete who's established, you know, physically. They've got a good sound technical understanding, because there's lots of stuff going on in that really short period of time. And that some people, the penultimate is something, the lowering, something happens naturally in some individuals. In terms of in terms of strategies, there's lots of different things. There's the knee. So a touchdown on the penultimate is, if you want to maintain the stride length, is with the shin angle you want to close that shin angle towards the ground. That will then lower the center of mass, meanwhile maintaining that horizontal direction. We've seen stride lengths change. So as you open up the stride length on the penultimate, that lowers the center of mass. And then when you shorten the takeoff leg, the direction of the hips has started to go up. Other athletes, they go short long. So they actually set themselves up really short, and then really lengthen, and they load. So they've got this big negative velocity coming into the board. But they need to be really strong, because they're going to kill the speed on that potentially. There are things where you can step out to the side, which displaces the hips. But again, then that affects that directional speed that you're going forward. So hopefully that helps. Here we go. Joe. How can coaches get those vertical and horizontal velocity figures? The vertical one is an interesting one. I think there are some apps now that measure and trace vertical velocities. Certainly, in the gym and kind of looking at vertical jumps, counter movement, drop jumps, that kind of stuff. There are apps that can measure that, but whether it could actually pinpoint the takeoff there. The horizontal velocities, typically at championships, originally we looked at 10 meters coming into the board. So we looked at speed gates at 11 meters and 6, and then 6 meters and 1. So if you've got a set of speed gates that you can set up, and you can get the athletes hitting those gates through the runway, that will give you those kind of 2 5-meter breaks between 11 and 6 and 6 and 1. From that, you will be able to determine if the athlete is accelerating or decelerating coming into the board. And ideally, you want to see them accelerating going in. Frank, have you got any other methods on that?
No, not really. They are quite expensive tools to buy, the speed gauges.
Yeah.
And what you find, most of the athletes that I work with, I think I have one in my group that I can use. But again, we're really dependent on biomechanics at major games or the national games like the 3As.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you've got a high-speed camera and counting the frames, that kind of stuff can actually have an impact as well.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Frank, this is directed to you. How would you fix the female athlete landing in a video? What would you do in training to solve? So this is from Claire. So you mentioned it briefly, talking about Spanovic's landing. So how would you fix that female?
Well, just looking at what she did, if you were to play that back, you see that at no point did she actually attempt to lift her feet up when she broke the sand, and that could be a core problem. You know, that could be a bit of weakness in her core, not being able to lift her feet up. So there's various things that you need to look at. Is the core stable enough? Are the hips stable enough? Loads of exercises to do, or loads of exercises that you can identify that will fix that problem. But yeah, generally, it is how quickly you lift that feet. I mean, if you can show that video again,
yeah, absolutely,
you will see.
Throw that a couple of times in.
Yeah. So she breaks the sand. Yep. Keep going. She doesn't lift those feet up. Can you see?
Yeah.
And they just drag through the sand. Most competent athletes will lift their feet up and then stop the back from hitting the sand too early. So as she hits it now, those feet should now keep going. Should lift, and you could see as you could see the knees fold a little bit.
Yeah,
that should have been lifted. And if you were to show one of the males jumping, you probably see that they would have lifted their feet. So why is she not able to fix that? Then you got to go back and look at her core. Is she strong enough? Is she weak enough?
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's a couple of things for me that I see. There's the coordination of our arms in relation to that. So, and you know, the plan for tonight was really not to get into too technical. No. When we look at the flight and the landing in the final session of these, for me, we can see the timing of the left arm is dictating. You know, so we could see that her arms are splayed like this. And we talk about coming out of the flight into the landing, we've got this kind of cause and effect where we actually want to push the arms past the center of mass to help keeping everything tighten up there. But because that right shoulder, right arm's back there, she's really not helping that backward rotation that's causing into the pit. So that's, you know, that's perhaps something I would look at in addition as well. But cool. Do you want to have a look at the other video, Frank? Are you happy with that?
No, it's up to you guys on the call.
Let's go to the next one. You mentioned athlete mobility, flexibility. Other common things that you see that may be limiting factors, either in the run-up or in the extension for the takeoff board. Yeah, good question, Aidan. For me, certainly, if you've got, especially with athletes just now, we've typically this kind of sedentary lifestyle, and a lot of athletes sitting around, spending a lot of time sitting at home. Well, in a normal days, they'd be sitting at school all day, sitting in a car, you know, and then come to training, and those hip flexors are really tight. And we want to see a nice extension, a nice range at takeoff. We've seen that the takeoff, that L1, that takeoff point can have a positive impact on the resultant distance. So if you've got tight quads, tight hip flexors through there, that could actually curtail and cut back or shorten that distance, which would then have an impact ultimately on that. So that's certainly seeing that. And then, you know, hamstrings, you know, again, not being able to effectively, you know, within the running mechanics and hitting those takeoff positions. So anything you want to add to that, Frank?
Yeah, I spend the first month of the winter months just doing a lot of flexibility, mobility work. I'll get someone really, really supple into the group and they'll go through it, and we just religiously do it for about a month. So it sticks with the guys. They know exactly what to do before a training session, and they know what to do when they're home as well. A lot of it can be done at home. You don't have to do it training, but you need to introduce it, and you need someone that's going to show them how to do it properly.
Yeah, I call it homework for my guys, you know, and you know, you can teach them what are some of the, you know, these are the positions we want to hit. This is, you know, how long we want to, you know, to spend time on these and holding the positions. But yeah, it's again, it's going back to that behavioural element. It's the athlete's responsibility. Yeah. You know, it's not the coaches. You know, you need to, you know, take ownership of that and you put the time in it. Okay, I think we're getting close to time there. How would you coach an athlete who has the tendency to land on feet and stay upright? Frank, I'm going to bat that your way, mate.
Well, there are several drills. As I said earlier on, a lot of it is the core stuff. Again, you could teach it by jumping onto a high jump bed, so they're not scared to land properly on a high jump bed. If you're going to do it in the sandpit, make sure you make a decent mound so that they can land on it without hurting themselves. It is, again, you isolate the landing, do loads and loads and loads of it until they get it right, and then introduce it into the jump. But it's quite, again, very, very simple. You need to look at, you know, their core stuff, their flexibility, their mobility. You need to look at all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, same here. I mean, it's the same thing for me. It's kind of understanding the concept and the feeling and the positions they need to be in. And like Frank said, you know, on the mat is ideal. Standing long jump, you know, as a, you know, we use that to test the athlete's power, but it's also great skill development exercise on working on the leg shoot on the long jump as well. So, and of course, once all those things are in place, then you can start thinking about, right, what happened preceded, you know, what happened in the flight or in the takeoff. Is something happening at takeoff that may have caused him to forward rotate and land on his feet and stay upright. So, but yeah, addressing the stuff that Frank had suggested would be my first protocol as well. Cool. Well, listen, I think that's us, Frank. Questions wise, we've answered them all. Any final thoughts for tonight?
Is that from me?
Yep, Frank.
I think your presentation was brilliant, Darren.
It's a team effort, mate. Team effort. Cool. Well, listen, guys. Frank, thanks again for being online and fielding the questions and stuff as well. Awesome, guys. Thanks again for signing up tonight. I think we've got one more slide to go before we sign off. What next? In terms of webinar series, a couple of weeks' time, we've got Alan Richardson talking about developing the Volter, Youth Volter for senior success. But in terms of these series, the long jump series, we will be back again on the 26th of August on looking at runway development, and we'll be looking at acceleration, upright running, but also looking at some of the training modalities to develop them. Then we'll look at the penultimate takeoff, flight and landing. And then next month, we've got Aston leading on, and again, we will look at the overview, look at the high-level stuff in the triple jump, and then we'll combine the two sessions on the 26th of August, looking at the run-up for both long and triple, and then we'll go into each of the phases into detail. Again, any questions, we have our regional coach leads, their contact details are there, and we do have regional online sessions planned in July, August, September. So if you've got any further questions from tonight, feel free to email me. If you've got any questions directly for Frank, again, email me and I'll forward them to him. And there's my email address at the end there. And just want to thanks again for everyone tonight.